This is Jim Fetzer, your host on The Real Deal.
In Dallas, Texas, 3 shots were fired at President Kennedy's motorcade.
It looks like one of those scenes of an old building being purposely dynamited and blown.
When we are successful, I'm just a patsy, and we will be.
We're ready to come to the microphone, so we'll listen up.
A new world order.
My name's Robbie Parker.
It might have appeared that way, but from my close-up inspection, there's no evidence of a plane having crashed anywhere near the Pentagon.
Let us never tolerate outrageous conspiracy theories concerning the attacks of September the 11th.
President Kennedy died at 1 p.m.
Live from the Media Broadcasting Center.
This is Jim Fetzer, your host on The Real Deal, where my very special guest today from Canada, Claire Kuhn, is going to be addressing research she has been conducting for quite a few years now on the question of whether Paul McCartney of the Beatles died in 1966 and was replaced by somebody strikingly similar in his appearance, which became a recent issue between Kevin Barrett and me on False Flag Weekly News when we ran a story about Ringo having confessed to what had happened, how they had a problem with Paul's death. Brian Epstein suggested they replace him. They tried it out. It seemed to work. No one noticed, but they felt self-conscious about it, a bit guilty. Claire has done so much on this that I'm very pleased to have her here to offer her thoughts and to share her research with us. Claire, welcome to The Real Deal.
Hello, how are you?
Good. Let's begin here with, you got a very nice photograph or two there. Tell us about them.
Well, this presentation has some imagery, but most of it will not be of Paul or of the contended replacement. I decided to start the presentation with some imagery, but we're going to discuss how to assess imagery without having our brains trick us if there is a trick, okay? So in this set at the top, we're seeing a very early staged photograph of the supposed replacement from very early 1967 or late 1966. It is carefully lit if the case that we will present is correct, very carefully done to de-emphasize one half of the face's jaw. So we have to note that there may be regular lighting and camera work used to trick the mind into ignoring certain features of a person. He also has a mustache, which was adopted by all Beatles in late 1966, early 1967. If there was a replacement, as we will contend, the argument goes that the replacement had sometimes a false and sometimes a real mustache, as he received slight plastic surgeries to increase the breadth of his lips up and down, which is easier. You cannot do side to side. And also to give some filler to the cheeks and so on, so that he had a mustache, and that the others had it also to deflect with bright clothing and mustaches and beards and longer hair and different haircuts to deflect from a significant change in one Beatle figure. So the issue here is to say that whether you believe or do not believe you see a difference in supposedly one historical figure, the historical figure may be two men. So we will refer to the person as Paul when it is before at the end of 66, and we will refer to the second supposed person as Sir Paul, because he has been knighted now, whether he is one man or two, or as Bill, which seems to be his name if he is in fact a replacement. So we have to get into the mindset first, as you know, Jim, of separating out categories to determine and to get used to determining each side of a case. Now, this case, unfortunately, as you know, has a very low percentage number of believers in it, or those that think it's possible. It does not mean it is or is not true. There's all kinds of education that needs to happen if somebody has been tricked. There are certain arguments, as you know.
Sure.
So what we will be really contending here is that anyone who has a true surety that there is no replacement, no death, that can't be psychological, no historical opportunity, all that stuff, that they actually would not be allowed on a jury. They have to remember that. They still are welcome to, of course, learn the case, but we will be presenting one side of it. Okay, we have to get used to the categories that would be necessary to determine that side, to build it up, see how complete it is, how wonderful, how bad, and then judge at the end. That's the approach that we need to take. And I'm just reminding people that that is, in fact, what we need to do. So we have to get used to calling Paul, Paul, and Bill, Bill, in case they are two people. It sets the mind up. It temporarily biases us towards the idea, but it does not have to be a permanent bias. We can always decide again later. So we're just going to use these things as though they are true to get used to the categories we would need to get used to if we were fully determining and fully conceiving the case. So the top photo is from late 66, early 67. The bottom set includes some of Paul, fairly young, 23 or 24. Then one of the promotional photos for early 67, which is not to just be compared on a youth or age factor with the one beside it. We're talking the top left image set there, but rather with a consistency. Do we see a consistency of not only youth and age as categories for difference, but of certain kinds of lengths of face, placement of nose, attitude, emotionally, sort of a roundness or not roundness in the jaw, that kind of thing, and curl of hair. So the top left includes an early and a fairly early contemporaneous photo of the second fellow, just at about the time that the photo with the gold jacket is. And then the two bottoms photos are of Paul, and then the one in the top right is of Bill during Strawberry Fields Forever. Okay, so and then we have the next slide. The next slide has a top left comparison of Paul with Bill much later. It is an age difference. It is a lighting difference. It is a slight angle difference. But what we will be asking is, can this head turn into that head with age? And if you believe it can, you need to take very strong, different photos and not simply assume that they are two different people, but to say, if I were seeing two different people, are some of the differences not transferable? Are the outlying examples impossible? So what some people assume about the Paul is dead people, as you know, Jim, is that they simply look at very strange lighting conditions and bad conditions, and then they just say he's different. What we will be arguing is that you need to take very outlying examples, know them well, and then see if there's a consistency in this head back to a similar photo of the supposedly separate person, and this head back to a supposedly similar photo, because two somewhat similar or tricking people will have some similarity photos, some very different photos, right? So it's whether the outliers can transform into each other, not just whether you ever get an outlying photo. So we can go to the next one, which has some of these images bigger. So you can see a consistency. Is it just youth? Is it also a tendency of people say a longer jaw for the second guy, but it isn't only that. It's the triangle from here, the apple of the cheek, to the general length and angle to the outer chin. So that's actually a plane. When you do sculpture, that's a plane. Okay. So people who are not familiar with sculpture might not realize what's happening in the lighting and what can and cannot be changed by surgery or angle. So there's a tendency, we are arguing, that older photo and that 1967 photo with the blue background, there's a tendency that those two will show up always as tendencies in the second man, even when he somewhat looks like this other person. The two are not transferable types. So if we can go to the talk slides, if you want to say anything in by the way of what you've discovered.
No, I'm interested in your presenting your view, Claire, and it might be better just to say I would argue rather than we, so people don't presume that you and I therefore have the same view about all this.
Okay, I meant we, meaning people who have taken some time with the case and who are speaking from the point that it could very strongly be true. So in other words, those that advocate for it, those who, if you were in a court, would be saying, this is the way we will be talking, right? This is the position. This is the way you have to see it. This is the way we will build it up for your final judgment. So I meant we in that sense. All right. So the conclusion claim, in other words, what we will be arguing as if we were kind of in a court argument, is that Paul died, that it was, many people think, murder, that he was replaced, that millions were fooled, and that many claims about the evidence and the history of the rumor are patently wrong. They're actually, you can directly prove some of it is wrong, even if you don't hold that Paul died and was replaced, or strongly contraindicated. Okay. So if we can go to the next slide. The issue is that we have three cases in one, really. We have a replacement contention, in which case the original either died or left the band. Okay. We have a death contention, in which case we definitely have a replacement, because historically we do know of a second fellow in this issue. And the death is either natural or unnatural if it occurred. Okay. We cannot trust any of our perceptions of whether something is impossible. We cannot trust any of our perceptions during the case that we see it or we don't. If we tend not to see it, we may be being tricked. If we definitely see it suddenly, we might bounce off and say, my gosh, I'm going crazy. So we have to be careful to let all of the positives work on us and to come to know the case intellectually as well as perceptually, right? I mean, that's what we're going to contend. The next slide, please. So basically, as we talk about this Paul dying and whether it was murder, that contention comes from certain amounts of evidence, but also reasoning about the evidence. That he was replaced means millions were fooled. However, if we go to the next slide. Thank you, Chance. We have to remember that when we say that millions could not be fooled, we are talking about something that sounds anti-common sense. But of course, there are many ways in which people are fooled. They can see a difference and misattribute it. They can say it's just age, lighting, camera, right? So they actually do see differences. They can hear differences and say it's a style change, it's a wish change, so on. They can ignore differences. They can be fooled by lighting, camera, and so on. So there are actual tricks being done on them, but some of it is their mind. And when we come to biography, history, people have a very low knowledge usually of the salient issues, if this were true, the kinds of things that begin to show up. And also when we talk about biography, people often in biographies put down the idea, but say, my gosh, though Paul is dead is wrong, he must have had a lobotomy to write some of that later music. Though Paul is dead is wrong, yes, there was a major style change. Though Paul is dead is wrong, and they go through all of the sorts of general impressions you would notice if there was a change, and discount each one and add no detail. So we will be counting each one for the storyline and adding detail. Okay, the next slide. So when we have fooling, this is just a summary slide. We have direct perception, which in a way does not count here until we're done, if you hate the idea. We have expectations that something will be true. We have grown men crying at concerts for Bill, which is fine. We're not saying you have to hate his music if he's double. We have not knowing how to tell, because people often say, oh, it's just camera and lighting, when that, upon close inspection, would not be so. We have intellectual knowledge. We have glossing over potential problems or taking time to really sort them out, which we're going to try to do. Next slide. This is a summary of how most would not be allowed on a jury. Okay, this case posits a trick. It's a trick in your mind if it's so, and it's a trick done to you. So there are aspects external and internal, if you know what I mean, Jim, right? I just wanted to have, you have any input? So well, it's not just me talking?
Well, I want you to have the opportunity to lay out your case, Claire, as to how you see it. And
okay,
you know, I'm curious why you presume a jury standard. I mean, I would assume a scientific standard rather than a jury standard, because with jurors, there are certain issues that arise about admissibility of evidence that don't necessarily enter into scientific inquiries as such. But that you are adopting that as your framework is a perfectly valid approach if you want to determine what would be legally admissible, and that might therefore be something that could be presented to a jury.
I'm more focusing on the attitude that the people listening need to take. Well, you can call it a scientific attitude, but a lot of people would not see that emotionally as a patience, as an emotional positivity, because we have to remember that this whole case, or any case, is a side. So I'm trying to get them to remember what they may have learned from crime or investigation of ideas. A court case is an investigation of an idea scientific-mindedly. Okay, the jury is allowed to think for themselves. They don't have to all be experts. They can learn from the case. They must be shocked, but also change sides. They hear objections on both sides. They still have to continue to the end. So I'm trying to remind people who may have had decades of conditioning, decades of prejudice, and not think. A lot of people think that if they just don't see it or whatever, that is direct perception and accurate and self-evident. And what I'm saying is that things that have gone on in the mind for years actually condition you not to notice or not to categorize something in a totally new way. So a jury would be reminded that as they listen, and they would go in hopefully open to the idea, as they listen, they may have to completely recategorize. They have to learn all the new ways of thinking about it. They have to build it up till it might be so, and see how far that idea works. Okay, so you know, that's my focus here, is that we have a prejudice very often, even directly when we see and hear, our brain filters. Then we sometimes apply wrong intellectual categories. We say that, for instance, you know, Jim, have you lost weight? No, I had a nose job. Okay, well, that happens. Or, gosh, Jim, just for a second, you didn't look like yourself. I'm sure it's fine. Most of the time, that's just fine in life. But if there's a double, that's exactly what you actually would be moved by. So we have to take it on and say, is there a huge circumstantial case, you know, and move on. Okay, so can we go to the next slide? This is so that if you want to pause through some of the text, you can. A trick is not only done to you, your mind does it to yourself. So we need to be very careful. Next slide. Now, there are direct common errors about this case. A lot of people know of the so-called art clues. They do not always know accurate information about them. They tend to know only one or two. Usually they think up an immediate answer and it's gone. But the rumor actually did not start in the US. It did not start in the famous period of 1969-70. That does not prove he died, but of course it's part of a storyline. If you can push the history back, then there's more naturalness to whether the actual thing started naturally as a rumor. So it actually started in September and late 1966. And we'll go into some of the evidence for that. And it started in England. It stayed fairly quiet for a while, but if it's real, that's what would have happened. Also, the famous death date is usually quoted as November 9th. It wasn't. It was September 11th. It's a numbered date written in UK dating. So even if he didn't die, the US people in 1969 misinterpreted a numbered date, no matter whether or not that's an accurate date or it's a joke. Okay. The next slide, please. So this is here about history and psychology. We do not use the history and the psychology as a pure proof. A lot of people that I've dealt with say, well, you don't have anything till you have DNA. Of course, history and psychology on a side of a case need to be discussed. We need all types of evidence. We need to know the whole storyline so that we have a case to fit the physical evidence into and the testimonial evidence into. Now, on the other hand, the next side of it is that psychology, that's okay, you can stay there, but the psychology itself is, on the other hand, not a show-stopping objection. A lot of people say the family couldn't do it. The friends couldn't do it. People wouldn't be quiet. Why wouldn't they talk now? Those kinds of things are actually not showstoppers unless you find specifically that they were showstoppers, because you never know whether there were all kinds of reasons that people felt, and we can run through some of them quickly: loyal, confused, overwhelmed, guilty, scared, paid off, putting it behind you. It's not your own lie, it's someone else's. Not having enough information to come out, not wanting to be a sore thumb, a tattletale. Now, what we do find, and we'll see this later, we will be skipping through it quickly, is that, yes, indeed, there seem to be some deaths around the case. The case itself, if we take on the side of the case, which we're doing like a court, we're going to believe it for a moment and try it out. Okay. There are some suspicious or become suspicious deaths, timing of deaths and so on, that were claimed to be for other reasons, but they are people surrounding this issue. If he died, you would expect some deaths. Okay, and we'll go into some very important points about that in a moment. So the case claims that there's a replacement, there's a death, there's a cover-up. It claims that there are two reasons for the replacement. One is the Beatles circle themselves, believing or disbelieving something about the death, overwhelm, fear of the public. Okay, murderers. If it was murder, then there were opportunists who actually made the replacement necessary. If there was not murder, there were at least help from intelligence to maintain it, to physically maintain it with the technologies. The death itself, reasons for the death: intelligence services in the JFK cover-up, crossing to England. I don't mean it was Americans. I mean that the kinds of people who wanted JFK dead or wouldn't want that to come out in a major way would have probably killed him. And there are very important reasons to think so, we will go into. There's also a second reason that some people get hung up on, which is infiltration. And that comes in from the era. If you know a fair amount about the era, the music, the Laurel Canyon scene, the infiltration of music and culture, the drug promotion, and so on, there were reasons to get someone who had a kind of a culty mindset and interests, alternative religion, might be on side with intelligence services, LSD, even possibly other deaths, okay, and get somebody in there. The cover-up itself has the reasons for silence. The most important reason that people forget when they discuss big conspiracies is social laziness. If I know that Jim did something that I don't want to stick out as a sore thumb and I don't have direct proof, I'm not running to the media. It's just typical. It's ordinary. And behind the scenes, we might mourn, we might share a beer, I might complain to you, but not do more. Also, the authorities would not be open to my going with a hint. And also, if I'm truly loyal to you and you made a bad decision, I'd rather not have you look bad. All right. Then there's the final thing that most conspiracy aware people overemphasize, which is threats and death. Okay. Those would simply usually take out someone with express information or someone who really begins to gather other people around. Right. If I begin to gather other people around and I say, I don't like this. I don't like this. I really don't like this. I still don't like this. Then others will tend to say, I don't either. That tends to happen behind the scenes, long before someone speaks. Those people would be taken out. And then others might feel scared or simply just not have someone to glom onto. And that will keep it quiet longer. That's the naturalness. Next slide, please. So if we're going to talk about two people, we have one historical figure. We have possibility of two real men or one in that historical figure. So I've written out here that if there are two, the sameness has explanations, new explanations, that they were similar to start with, or there were certain things done to increase similarity in certain angles. And any differences have some things are different simply because of lighting, as always, and age. And some things would be naturally different. Okay, so that we have to know what would be naturally different, what would show up in an outlying photograph, what would you. If it's one person, then we use simple explanatory categories. We have to be careful that they're not excuses, and that's what this whole case is about. And as we recategorize into the two, we have to complete the process. Because if we have not fleshed out the idea of two people and see just how well it works and where it works, then we probably have not seen whether it is one or two. So we temporarily bias ourselves towards two, and the Bill and Paul idea, the Paul and Bill idea, just to see how far it goes, where it goes, and so on, and really get to know it properly. Next slide, please. So psychological objections, as I said, unless there's someone is physically incapable of lying, or there is a set of authorities to tell safely, including a public that wants to know, a psychology of whether people would tell is moot. It's as a starting point for objections, unless you come up against something like that. The real question is whether it was done. If it was done, then specific psychology doesn't have to be known, because there are many ways, as I've covered some of them that already, that people can find themselves making excuses and feeling differently and mourning in private and seeing themselves as loyal and being afraid. Okay. So we can determine some likely psychology issues, but it's not necessary to continue with the case. And people get upset by that quite often. They want this to be a showstopper argument, and it isn't to start with. Next slide, please. As we try out the new idea, we do have to be careful. I'm fully aware of that. I'm also fully aware of how bizarre this sounds. I'm fully aware of all of that side of it. We do have to be positive. That doesn't mean we have to force positive feelings, but it does mean, like a jury. That's why I was emphasizing jury, Jim. Like a jury, we need to actually let any positive feelings come. If we begin to see a difference and say, gosh, he really looks different there, we have to not quickly say, I might be going crazy, or that has to be age, or it has to be drugs, or he suddenly had a growth spurt, okay, or lighting or camera. We have to stick with those positive feelings enough to say, that did move me. I'm going to continue. Or with the art clues or other psychological considerations, say, that is rather striking. That does put that differently. I'm going to continue, instead of, well, that isn't proof because it's not my seeing it directly and it's not DNA. You have to continue positively and judge at the end. Next slide, please. So the notion that Paul died started with a rumor. And the rumor, as I said, did not start when it got famous. There's a lot of misinformation and disinformation about that. For years, people assumed that it had started in 1969, that it was written by students. It was called into a radio station by students. They'd made it up. One of them even said, I made it up. Later clarified that he made up his particular version and added to the idea, but he did not get it himself. Okay. The actual notion, as we will see soon, came from England, and there are direct pieces of evidence for that. The rumor, however, did already contain some evidentiary claims. It claimed that there were things in art and music, lyrics forward, lyrics backwards, meanings, constellations of artworks, and so on, that might show this idea to at least be a notion the Beatles were putting out. Nowadays, there's one idea is that it was done, but it was a hoax for any reason, that it was a hoax as a joke, a money ploy, a metaphor, a cruelty to the public, a cruelty to the Paul figure. Remember, I have to use the term Paul figure now because we have to distinguish as to whether it was to Paul or to Bill once we're arguing this particular side. Okay, so the questions were first asked about these evidential areas. If we can go to the next slide. The hypothesis now is usually that it was a hoax. So then we have to try to sort of prove that it was likely a hoax. Why was the rumor large? When did it start? Were there any surprises in the evidence? Now, it turns out that a lot of the people who believed this or were very interested in 1969-70 and a little thereafter were not true believers in the notion. They have been misrepresented as merely needing a public myth, a psychological reason to make meaning out of bizarre, surreal music or art. But in fact, no one really noticed in numbers that there were these fairly emphatic, bizarre things that were constantly coming up in Beatles artwork until they heard the notion. So on the one hand, the artworks are there. On the other hand, people aren't noticing till they have the notion. And when they did notice it, they noticed some very strange things, which we will go into. So not everyone just believed, a lot just wondered. And the media then did some interviews. They got some of the supposed perpetrators and involved people to talk. There were testaments one way and testaments the other. The testaments for it were taken as a joke. The testaments against it were taken as the truth. So there is testimony, which you would expect, but you would have to see it one way for our side and one way for the other side. And this side, as we will note, actually finds some very important details in those testimonies that almost no one notices when they're in the other side. So one way to judge the validity of a case is how much texture and detail it notices in evidence. The next slide, please. Nope. Is there any other evidence than those art clues? Yes, now we do know more. We know more biographically about the Beatles. We know more about their artworks. We know, and also it's more comparable on the internet. Okay. The internet has allowed this idea to spread, but unlike some ideas, which are bizarre, they don't spread very far because the support for them is rather thin and so on. This idea actually spread rather quickly. Within 5 to 10 years, there were more leaks and so on. So we can blame the internet as being a silly place, or we can see that with more comparisons and more material known, a true case would also receive more attention. There are testaments. As I said, you just simply have to determine which way you're going to interpret them. There are documents. There's history for the rumor known now more widely. There's history for the Beatles known more widely. History for the era and conspiracies around that era, if you wish to know about the Laurel Canyon, the JFK, and so on. We know more about that. The LSD, MK Ultra, those questions are more known now. And these things all start pointing away from the hoax idea. It does not mean you have proved it exactly, but it's important for the general proof. Next slide, please. Whether we have an odd or regular case, we always, of course, have to ask what's natural, what's commonsensical. We need to do that for the evidence and for the general ideas. So if we have a storyline, the storyline has to sort of make sense. And as we deal with evidence, it has to fit the actual items more accurately. And we have to know both sides. That's why I emphasize jury. We have to know both sides of this case. Otherwise, we have not done our due diligence. Next slide. Next slide, please. Thanks, Chance. Is there any other evidence Yes, actually, the images and sounds historically have mostly been lost in the discussion. There are famous clues and there are less famous clues that were known at the time of the big brouhaha in the USA in 1969. So the simplicity of the art clues, the basic simplicity to find them and how they're emphasized, is usually not emphasized in articles against the idea. Okay. Also, the complexity comes from the psychological needs they represent. If they are true, they show grief, grisliness, detail, forensic issues, loneliness, guilt, and so on, that you wouldn't expect from a joke, which might more reasonably switch between different methods of death, be kind of silly, and so on. So the real complexity with the clues is that they recombine and recombine and recombine. That's where most of the complexity is, except for a few clues. And all of these reasons start pointing away from the hoax idea. Next slide, please.
Claire, this is all quite fascinating, but you haven't shown us any of the evidence, any of the clues, any of the things you're talking about. So you're talking about things you're going to be showing us, but you're not showing them in order for us to know what you're talking about. I think that's and you want to take advantage of the time because, you know, that you have a lot to cover and not a lot of time to do it.
Yeah, a lot of these slides will go by fairly quickly, but it's actually, you've raised a very important point, which is that one of the actual accusations against this case is that it should be easy, obvious, require very little talk. You see it, you get it, you read a few things, you get it. And that is not true for the open-minded but perceptually long, deeply ingrained counter belief. So what I'm doing is for those who want to say somebody lost a bit of baby fat and the idea of a massive cover-up from the Beatles and that they wouldn't have the idea is silly, is that actually there's all kinds of reasons to do a proper categorization to see the case. So what most people do when they start this case is they show tons of stuff. And that stuff is seen as, yeah, but I don't see the difference. Yeah, but I don't hear the difference. Yeah, but this is stupid. And what we need to do is actually condition the person to listen and understand the categories that they will need to when they go away from this broadcast. Because I can show a million things and I haven't covered the whole case. So when they go away from this, we need to say all the major objections have answers. Some are intellectual answers from expertise in other areas like psyops, black ops, psychology. Psychology has lies, justification, loyalty, diversions. The political social protection rackets have rogue elements. This is normal in history. You do not have to believe a particular conspiracy theory to know this. Perception and expectations are high when your emotions are listening to somebody say, oh, I've been to Bill's concert, but I'm calling him Paul. Okay. I've been to this man's concert. I really enjoyed it. I only know this man as Paul. I rarely look at the early photos. I rarely look at the early material. I like Wings. Oh, but he sang yesterday in 1980. One of the people objecting to your article recently, Jim, said that he was at a concert in 1980 and all of the people were crying and the man played yesterday. And this just simply is proof. Of course, Bill can play, if he's Bill, he can play yesterday and he can play it nicely, well, many years later. He doesn't have to be note for note. And he can be a feeling musician in that moment, but he can be playing someone else's song. And the cachet, the accrued power of the original Beatle and his original energy are playing into how much people cry. That doesn't mean you can't also cry at a Bill concert. Okay. So the next slide, please, quickly. Are we on? Okay. The psychology and cover-ups are not what you think. I have made a point that there's lots of common psychology in cover-up. Much of it is, I don't want to stick out like a sore thumb. And people usually die in a cover-up when they can't get to an authority, right? Or when they are making a ripple behind the scenes. So if we go to the next slide, We note that this case affected millions. Behind the scenes, people would have been affected, but some would have justified the situation. And if we have merely entertained the idea, well, that's also interesting if we have the time. Now, this case, unfortunately, also has benefited many people who would not want to talk. And as I said about some of the deaths we're going to get into, the reality is that if I talk to Jim behind the scenes, I might say, look, Jim, I really don't like it. I really don't like it. I really don't like it. But how important are you, the public, really? How much do you really think you matter? You matter when you matter. And we have to remember that. We have to remember that we matter in spirit or emotion, but people will not come out to you if they feel a loyalty or they start making excuses. It was a long time ago, or they thought it was kind of cool, kind of interesting, and they don't know why Paul died if he died by murder. So they don't have an extra reason to try to come out. They just think, well, the Beatles were stuck. So if we go to the next slide. People can be crazy, and they can be wrong. Some of the people in the PID thing are being a bit uncareful, in my strong opinion, but that doesn't mean that in general, the overall reasonableness of the case can't work. If we go to the next slide. Actually, at the bottom of the last one, it's okay. Any case like this will always be formally undecided forever. So you can make a decision and you can stand up at a dinner table and it can be true as heck or untrue as heck. And it won't matter to the next new person who's never heard it. And they want to tell you you're crazy. So real craziness and actual belief will always be at issue until somebody officially comes out and does a show-stopping broadcast. Now, the next thing is this thing here is in response to some of the people on your article. Several said that the man was the same. He has the same looks, talent, movement, soul. You can't fake that. Well, actually, again, with categorization for looks and categorization for how you feel about him, indeed, you can fake it because you're not faking everything. You're actually faking only some movements sometimes. You're being excused for most changes because you don't have to do note for note mimicry. Your own life will become the first person's life. Much of the time, you're yourself. You're not faking being Paul most of the time. Do you understand how that would work? So we have to understand the categories do not preclude faking being someone else because you don't have to be them anymore. You are being yourself with the odd toss off to some other person. The next slide, please. Are we going to the next slide? Thanks. There was a rumor first, as I said. Most people did not believe it. They just wondered. But some took it quite seriously, and there's a reason why. The materials they were looking at form constellations. They form groups of so-called clues. They are very prominent in most situations. They are very psychologically plausible now that you have the notion that he died. If you have the notion that he died, you get it from the supposed rumor. Then you look at the clues and you say, my gosh, I think something's going on. And usually that is misrepresented in the history books now as just silliness about some bizarre notions. If we go to the next slide. The rumor shows natural timing and content. The art clues show a surprising coherence and detail over the years. And the art clues are conceptually confirmed, therefore, by the kind of pattern they create. And some self-evident clues. Some clues have to scientifically have been planted at some point. If we go to the next slide. The art clues often do reveal a mindset and specific memories. We have to understand that art actually does do that quite often. We've got to get out of the idea of 1930s that art means whatever it means, whenever it means it. Actually, it's very uncommon. Okay, art very often can be interpreted. We just simply have to know the context. So we have this notion, and we're seeing whether that is a good context for some of this artistic material. Most of the clues are not hard. Actually, they're quite detailed. They do exist as to something. The Beatles were doing something, and we'll see several reasons why. So the idea that there was nothing to it at all are silly. If we go to the next slide. The forensic issues, of course, forensics are never conclusive if you don't want them to be. Okay. Actual evidence seems to be self-evident sometimes and less self-evident. But if we want to say that that we need DNA and fingerprints or voice prints, we could do voice prints without getting special permission. Okay, that's the one. This is the one case among all the conspiracy cases where we can actually do more physical tests ourselves, the way that you did with Costello on the Zapruder film. There is extant material that could be physically tested other than body tissue that we do not have. People who ask for DNA or fingerprints are, of course, asking for something that would have to have a chain of custody. And it would also have not to have any cover-up attached to that DNA. It would have to have a control, as you mentioned in the broadcast with Larson. It would have to have a control with known McCartney family members, right? So it wouldn't just be Sir Paul's own kids. It would be the brother or cousin known from Liverpool or the family here in Canada that are McCartneys or whatever, okay? So what we have to realize in that last point is that ears, hands, eyes, feet, face, shape, proportions, body language, attitudes, historical opportunity, and so on. These actually are forensic considerations, which if they all tend towards there being a double or strongly tend, you begin to see it, then he is a double. There's reasonable to know that yourself. We are not trying to get a DNA case to know it in that way. We are trying to get a strong knowledge that there is no other way to explain this material showing up in every reasonable area if he were a double. We have to ask, what are the reasonable areas to look for? Hair, teeth, and so on. And then see, is there a tendency? Are there things that cannot usually be from one person and they show up everywhere? Next slide, please. Sorry, I think that was a doubling slide. Okay, so when there is a similar person, in this case, we've accepted for decades this man. If he's a double, we see him as a mere continuation. We excuse all kinds of things in his life because we say that is Paul older. So we're not actually asking him to be Paul. We're gaining a new idea of who Paul would have been. Okay, next slide. How is it? It's easy to fool people up to a certain point, and it's easy to accomplish a killing up to a certain point. But of course, it's not willy-nilly. It's not all fake all the time. There are people now claiming that all kinds of stars and all kinds of politicians and all kinds of Beatles were replaced willy-nilly. But that is not only a priori unlikely, it also is directly disprovable if you're open to the disproof. So we're not saying it's completely easy, but there is an easiness to fooling you if you're making excuses for biographical material or body language or not accepting that high tendency or specific kinds of things just would not be there if you weren't a double. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so we need to change our idea of how things come out. If they come out, they don't necessarily come out with a show-stopping revelation. They tend to come out in small ways. If authorities are not available to talk to, then of course they won't come out in that way. Next slide, please. Why didn't people speak? They did. So we don't have no testimony. We have conflicting testimony. We have excused testimony. We have people saying, for instance, the brother of Paul said, I last saw my brother at his funeral, when he was directly asked not if Paul died, but when he last saw his brother. Okay. A person who wants to say something knows that they will be able to get away with it. If this case is so, and that's how we're considering it, like a jury. Okay. A person who wants to tell the truth and not perjure themselves to themselves can mentally equivocate. They can say, Paul. So Paul is alive. He didn't die, but they know the question was really about whether the original died. Okay. When Mike McGear, he's changed his name from McCartney to McGear. When he was asked, when did you last see your brother? He said, my brother? At his funeral. And immediately the laughter started, and he knew he could get away with it. Okay, so there are ways people can ease their consciences without actually lying. And other times they may lie. So this does not prove Paul died isolated. Everyone expects that each item that you would marshal, whether it's audio, visual, art, or biographical like that, Jim, has to be the proof. And we're not saying that. We're saying you have to know all of this that you would not know on the other side. You'd immediately laugh it away and say that doesn't matter. But of course, it's testimony. So we are reinterpreting testimony from this side. Okay. Most would not have much direct evidence. Most people would only follow a buzz of dissent within the group. There is no real authority to go to. You would be laughed at with most police departments, or there would be a cover-up. We're arguing. And you, the public, are the real authority. You are the one that might guilt trip the people and say you were a conspirator, an accessory conspirator, or a plotting conspirator. And people do not tend to want to look bad. Next slide. Is this the next slide? Okay. Yes, so we need a reason to lie. We need a historical opportunity and ability. We need a reason for the death if it's unnatural. We need people to recognize that there would be a cover-up. You wouldn't have much proof yourself. Next slide. The next slide is. This case is like a family secret. You have to think of it that way if you're going to think about most of the people who are accessories. So we mentally have to understand that a lot of it is loyalty, excuses, guilt, letting time flow, and so on. But there would be payoffs and the machine and the power of the Beatles image. Next slide. People died for this secret. We are arguing that several people died. Okay, Tara Brown, Mal Evans, Brian Epstein, John Asher, and possibly some others, maybe even parts of why John died and George was actually assassinated, or there was an attempted assassination. He died within a year of that from a metastasized cancer, which took over once he'd been stabbed 40 times. That some of it may have to do with this cover-up, some of it may not. But if people died, they would tend to be taken out because they began to cause a problem. Okay, next slide. Why would they be causing a problem, and why would they be taken out? Okay, if I knew something about Jim, I knew some juicy material about Jim, and I liked Jim, then I might say to Jim, I'm really bothered by that, but I wouldn't tend to run to the media. But if I'm making a buzz behind the scenes, others, if Jim has powerful friends, might take me out because they don't want others to hear me causing a ruckus. What would the cover-up be for on the Beatles circle level? They would tend to be overwhelmed, afraid that a new 4 or a Fab 3 wouldn't work. Now, some people sit back now and say you could do some wonderful records, you could do some eulogies, everybody'd love them anyway. Probably not to the Beatles' own beliefs in late 1966. Plus, under overwhelm, they would tend to believe that they couldn't really feel well after Paul's gone. And yeah. The next slide. We also, however, have another reason for the cover-up, which is that the quick replacement was in months only. Paul was a gentlemanly young man. He would have been a great spokesperson for JFK Truth. He began to become very good friends with Mark Lane. You know Mark Lane very well. He wrote a book in 1966, which came out in August, right before the putative death of Paul. Paul got a manuscript copy of it. He was convinced that JFK had not been killed by Oswald. He wanted to help with the movie that would come out the next year, write the score. He said, I want to have done something other than be a Beatle. And if anyone knew of his growing collaboration with Mark Lane, they would recognize that Sir Paul would be a great, intelligent, calm spokesperson for this idea. Even if he rarely talked, he would make it seem normal to be going to the movie and reading the book. And as you know, that sort of thing from a Beatle would not be tolerated among intelligence services worldwide.
Claire, on that tantalizing thought, we're going to take our break. This is Jim Fetzer, your host on The Real Deal, with my special guest today, Claire Kuhn, discussing her research on the hypothesis that Paul McCartney died, possibly having been murdered in 1966, and was replaced by a strikingly similar-looking replacement. We'll be right back.
Hi, I'm Josh Steffler from Freedom Free for All Television, and with the media going completely corporately controlled in this day and age, we couldn't put shows on like this without the help of our independent media partners, MBC, Media Broadcasting Center. So if you Hi, I'm Josh Steffler from Freedom Free for All Television, and with the media going completely corporately controlled in this day and age, we couldn't put shows on like this without the help of our independent media partners, MBC, Media Broadcasting Center. So if you like this show, check them out on webookyourshow.com, and you can find all sorts of different channels promoting liberty, freedom, and an independent press and an independent media. Thank you for watching.
We can now say, with moral certainty and considerable scientific authority, that the death of JFK was committed by a meticulously executed conspiracy which was obscured by an extensive cover-up. Murder in Dealey Plaza, edited by James Fetzer, goes to the heart of the JFK assassination. You'll read new and up-to-date information regarding the Secret Service, the Lincoln limousine, the medical evidence, the cover-up, altering the film, framing the patsy, and the silent historians. Also, 16 smoking guns, each one crushing the government's lone assassin scenario. A world-class chronology of November 22nd, 1963. Chapters by David W. Mantic, Gary Aguilar, Vincent Palomara, Douglas Weldon, Jack White, Ira David Wood III, James H. Fetzer, Doug Horn, and a classic essay by Bertrand Russell. The complete story in the pages of one single book, edited by James H. Fetzer. Read it now, read it again. You'll use it as a reference. Murder in Dealey Plaza. Available at Amazon.com and major bookstores around the world. It's murder.
Less than 3% of you people read books, because less than 15% of you read newspapers. Right now, there is an entire generation that never knew anything that didn't come out of this tube. This tube can make or break presidents, popes, prime ministers. Television is not the truth. Television is a circus, a carnival, a traveling troupe of acrobats, storytellers, dancers, singers, jugglers, sideshow freaks, lion tamers, and football players. We deal in illusions, man. None of it is true. But you people sit there day after day, night after night, all ages, colors, creeds.
Broadcasting live on network radio.
So turn off your television sets, turn them off now, turn them off and leave them off.
This is Jim Fetzer, your host on The Real Deal.
In Dallas, Texas, 3 shots were fired at President Kennedy's motorcade.
It looks like one of those scenes of an old building being purposely dynamited and blown.
When we are successful, I'm just a patsy, and we will be.
We're ready to make to come to the microphone, so we'll listen up.
A new world order.
My name's Robbie Parker.
It might have appeared that way, but from my close-up inspection, there's no evidence of a plane having crashed anywhere near the Pentagon.
Let us never tolerate outrageous conspiracy theories concerning the attacks of September the 11th.
President Kennedy died at 1 p.m.
Live from the Media Broadcasting Center.
This is Jim Fetzer, your host, continuing my conversation with Claire Kuhn from Canada, who's done an extraordinary amount of work on research on the hypothesis that Paul McCartney died in 1966 and was replaced by a strikingly similar look-alike. Claire, please continue.
Okay, So what we've done is we've talked about objections. We've talked about the way that people would function. And Jim, as you said, okay, so we want to get to the evidence. But we have to remember that testimony in a court would include experts who pointed out. It would be testimonial evidence the same way that I've been doing, that psychology would work this way, or this is what happened in 1966 with, we'd be calling Mark Lane to speak about his experience, which he wrote about in his book, and that sort of thing. So we would actually have evidence that I've covered. Now, the next, the one thing that I didn't mention about evidence for the motivation for murder, there's the timing of a quick replacement. The idea would not come from the Beatles. This would not be normal. The death date itself has a significance regarding 9/11. Okay. It also had opportunity that week to occur. And then there's also that there was a wish to infiltrate the arts more and more. We know about this through many means for promotion of countercultural, controlled opposition stuff. Okay. So the next slide is. The forensics categories we're going to be dealing with, very importantly, we will be dealing with the fact that if we expect DNA and fingerprints to be the only kinds of evidence that we can marshal, then we are actually claiming that everything we see and hear is wrong, but we will believe a tissue test. And of course, that is a very abstract thing. We actually have material that is less abstract. We will be going over some of that. The other thing is that some things can and cannot be changed by plastic surgery. They would show up in those outlying examples of photos I talked about. And the forensic questions must be heard in full. A lot of PID people tend to put up a photo, make a comment, and a PIA, Paul is a live person, tends to say, that might be not a problem. So we have to understand all arguments in full. Next slide. All right. We have to conceptually recategorize. We may directly perceive wrongly, and we may say something is age, age, weight, and so on when it is not. Next slide. The music. Okay. So now here's another set of evidentiary types of evidence you will run into. Music can have a different feel for different people. We can miss excellence in certain kinds of people and still believe we are in the presence of pure genius if we are emotionally biased towards it. Paul's own original compositions drive the hysteria among people who are listening to Yesterday, played by Bill. Doesn't mean Bill can't be a wonderful musician, but it came out of a different person, we're claiming. Paul's own works now are biographically even put down. And you know this, Jim, probably you've run into this. People who say, I love everything from 67 forward. It's weird and wonderful, and Wings is great. But actually, of course, Beatlemania was the original 4 Beatles. And if this case is correct, Paul has been gone 48 and a half years, double his lifespan. 3 Beatles are dead. 5 Beatles were there total. It was a massive coup because it supposedly didn't even happen. Unlike the Kennedy case or 9/11, at least something is known to have happened. In this case, it's a brilliant kind of a coup where you don't even know something happened. Next slide. Next. Got next? Yeah. Music technique. Here's some other evidence, okay? Left-handedness would have to be learned, yes, but they did not play bass or even any instruments on film for over 1.5 years. They played air instruments. When Paul, meaning Sir Paul Bill, played, he played the piano first in a broadcast. Another year or two later, he played the bass far away at a rooftop concert. He may have gotten better at a left-handed bass by then. Okay. He would also improve further. He would, if he's a bigger man, he would need a guitar that's bigger generally. And one of the pieces of evidence marshaled in the case is that he did, in fact, take a bigger guitar. It's called a Rickenbacker. It's a couple of inches longer and bigger. He claims that the original Hofner bass of Paul, supposedly himself, is now lost, okay, stolen. And he had a Hofner made custom built. This would be the kind of thing that you would find, and therefore it is evidence towards the case. Others also would have to take on more bass playing in the later Beatles years, and in fact, you do find evidence of John and George playing a number of tracks, not always as well, on the bass. Next slide. See, these are evidence, but they're not just looking at something. Okay, the case does not rest on any one pillar. You have to continue with everything. The replacement period is evidence. The replacement period has a period that is always recognized as a time of major upheaval. Yes, the Beatles were planning not to tour again or tour for a while, but they hadn't said they would tour never again. That was announced in October 1966 by their manager. The manager had a breakdown. That is another piece of historical evidence. He had near suicide, which is left out of the anthology book. So there's a number of things also in evidence is missing and changed history. There's de-emphasizing of certain facts. Now, Paul himself had a broken tooth. It was an incisor. He had a broken tooth in early 1966. That date of that motorcycle crash has now been changed to after touring in 1966. So there seems to be a conflation of a real accident known about and a supposedly unreal death accident at the time. So that is also evidence, we would argue, historically, that they are covering up. Okay. The replacement himself would continue to have his own fans. If he had announced he was Bill, if they all announced it, it would be fine. He does continue to do concerts. He's well beloved, but he is not Paul. That's what we're saying. Next slide. So the simplification of the case, and then we'll get to some imagery, is that either no clue exists for any reason, clues exist, but they are clues to nothing. They are a joke, hoax, money ploy, or whatever, or that a full case exists now, including clues in the sense of art clues, but also historical, facilitative, bass playing issues, mannerisms, history, psychology, and so on. That those are now more known. Next slide. This is the coat of arms of the producer of the Beatles. He was very influential with the Beatles. He was great friends, and he would definitely know. He would be one of the people very much in the know that Paul died. He's a generally seemingly nice man. He did love them. He is connected through the top company for his company, EMI, to military purchases. But he himself is not necessarily in on that. There are people who think that he would cover up only as some horrible conspirator. However, his coat of arms emphasizes that there were 3 Beatles. We see 3 stag Beatles, meaning male Beatles, of course, in a metaphor. He was asked about this and said John was left off. John had been assassinated, so he's left off. But if you can imagine forever being left off because you were assassinated, that wouldn't make sense. So what we have here is 3 original Beatles and a tire tread through the center. Blue itself, by the way, in heraldry does not mean water. It means loyalty. The tire tread is white. We will find the emphasis on a white car, which may have been what was staged or actual hit on Paul. It has 5 tire tread lines through the center, which also double as musical stave lines. And also it's 3 Beatles after John died. So it's got 2 meanings for 3, if we're correct here. Next slide. The rumor was made famous in 1969, but it didn't start there. Okay. There was a misinterpretation directly of the death date, even if the death date itself doesn't exist. Okay. So we will get to the fact in an image in a moment, what people saw as a bunch of numbers and interpreted that, but they interpreted it in a U.S. way in 1969. But if it's there, and if he died then too, but even if it's there, it would have to be interpreted in a UK dating style, which would make it not November 9th, but September 11th. Next slide.
Claire, are you there?
Why bother with art clues? A lot of people. No, I'm here. I'm here. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Okay. So I should continue? Okay.
Keep going.
Sorry, guys.
Keep going.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. So
yes, we can. Keep
okay.
going.
So what?
Yes.
What can? So why bother with the art clues? They're famous. Okay. Can we apply the theory to evidence? Yes, and see how far it goes. All right. Next. Next slide. If two people are similar in some ways, but in their nuts, not a rather large change, but it's a rather large change between two people, we might have wrongly categorized it. Next slide. This is about odd ideas, how they can be real, but odd. Next slide. This is just for the benefit of people who want to read through more background ideas. Next. And also more. Next. We may wish to perceive something or not wish to perceive it. But of course, forensics are never ironclad, but we need to work at them. Next slide. Do we even want to know? Do we think this is important? Well, to millions it is, or would be. It also will shock us at how we can make perceptual errors, even if it is untrue, we learn about those. It opens some people up to more political coups. And as you know, Jim, in the JFK case and so on, a lot of people think that they want to know because it's political. Other people don't care because it's political. This thing happened in their own personal living room backyard, if you will. And so some people actually are more disturbed by this than by JFK's death. Next slide. We are going from an idea to the evidence, but it flows both ways. We need to be reasonable both ways. Next slide. A rumor can be natural and not a sick need. Okay. When there is a true event, there will be a rumor. Next slide. The famous rumor, we are now getting into some visual evidence here. The rumor actually hit the mass media in 1969. It's now known to go back to the period of the rumored death. We have several pieces of evidence. One is Tony Barrow, the press agent, who speaks in his book that it was September or close thereby, and in one day, that a set of people asked whether Paul had died. Emilio Lari, a photographer for the Beatles in 1965 on the movie Help, has come out and said, absolutely, I do not believe this guy is the same guy. And also, I heard the rumor in London in late 1966. The Day in the Life book has unspecified newspaper articles. It says were of the period, but it says it in its paperback edition, not its hardcover edition. There are 4 anecdotes available now of people who say that in New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania, there was an interruptive news flash during the broadcast of the Monkees, who were the replacement band, if you will, for the Beatles, the production of the United States, so to take over some of that energy. That there was a news flash on September 12th, which would have been within 24 hours of the death, and that they heard that in a news flash that there would be more news after the show, but a serious accident had happened to a Beatle. One woman says she remembers it specifically because she discussed it in school the next day when there was no further news. There's also what we're getting to now, the disclaimer print reference. So we need to move to the next slide. This is the first extant text reference. There may be those newspapers, and there's the testimony of Barrow and Lowry, but this is the first extant one. All right. It says the event did not happen. It claims that all major events of the rumor already are in the rumor. It is closely connected to the Beatles themselves. It's from a fan magazine they had a lot of involvement in. It is natural for a real death to have an awkward early disclaimer and then to shut up. Next slide is the picture of the text reference. This is February 1967. The false rumor is declaimed once in text, probably regretted thereafter. Comes out in February 67. It mentions a car crash, Paul, and death. Those are the significant things for the later rumor. Of course, it says it didn't happen. It also claims a wrong date for the start of the rumor and for the supposed death, which would try to deflect people who heard the rumor in the future. It also begins to emphasize mustaches will be coming. So the beginning of the change is right under it. Next slide. This is the source for the text. Next slide. The death date itself has inaccuracies too, I mentioned. Whether real or imagined, the death date comes from a numbered clue, numbering. Whether it's real or not, it actually would have to be read in UK dating, which makes 9/11 be 11/9. Day, then month. Next slide. We have several reports for this date. It fits all of the historical references. Except one, and that one can easily be explained the other way. It is on the center round drum skin of the what do you call it? Of the Sgt. Pepper album. Lennon loved Lewis Carroll. He would have wanted to use something like Lewis Carroll for his album. And if you go to the next slide, we'll see it. All right, so the Sgt. Pepper's drum skin is here. Normally you would see Sgt. Pepper's and on the bottom, Hearts Club Band, and in the middle, Club Band, and in the middle is Lonely Hearts. If you mirror that, you get one, then the word one, then a one again, an X, he, an arrow, and die. Okay, that would be 1-1. 1-1. IX is 9 for Roman numerals. He, die. Now, this particular clue, if we move to the next slide, has a great deal of historical support, okay? I'm not going to go into it right now. I just want to flip by this. But the one thing to note is that this is not a usual kind of clue. It is the one clue which is the most hard to find, but it has a whole bunch of references which lead you to it. The whole cover has references to death, and the credit for that particular item, because they gave a whole credit on the inside the album, for back of the album for it, in an insert. The whole credit is Joe F. Grave made it. An epitaph and grave, of course, imply it is one. But that doesn't mean people would think of mirroring an image. That was probably leaked in the early part of the rumor. That's the explanation we would give it on this side. Next slide. Again, this is 3 cases in one, but if there's a replacement, there doesn't have to be a death, but there's a lot of evidence around that. If there's a death, there has to be a replacement, and if there's a death, it does or doesn't have to be murder. Next slide. We can be certain as a feeling and knowing, or we can just feel something, or we can know it. Only pure mathematics is absolute, because it sets terms, as you know, Jim, of course, and logic at the same time. Next slide. We're not in court. Does it matter? No, we may prefer the formalism, but we don't always get it. Next slide. If we were in a court, they would call people to testify. They would hope they wouldn't lie. They would be able to get more and certain kinds of evidence, but that does not mean that the evidence we are marshaling and the arguments we are marshaling would not be included. Next slide. A lot of people say that the replacement had a family. Why wouldn't his family complain? We do not know, of course, if he was estranged, if he was intelligent, if they do know, if other people know, or whatever. That's not actually an objection. It's just whether it was done and whether he's the same. We also need to remember, of course, that we can do voice print analysis. If the voice prints were found to be different, what would you think? Would you accept it like DNA? Or would you say that those kinds of things are from not original voice samples? They weren't original. They're not the original tapes. Would you question the expert who did it? Well, what you would want is best case samples, and you'd want a statistics. Unfortunately, it costs $15,000 to $20,000 United States money to do that, and the person might come under pressure not to talk. We do have a man who did it in 1970. He did voice prints, of course, but he refused to talk thereafter, and we do not have his method. We do also know he used songs, which are not court admissible. Only spoken word is. Okay, next, he was a doctor at Florida State University named Dr. Henry Truby. Next slide. The replacement, who is he? He doesn't have to mimic too closely. He's not a cover band. Okay, we accept a lot of things about his history. We don't have to have him be the same. Is it possible? Yes, he could come from intelligence services or be on their side. Next slide. Okay, voice morphing was done for all Beatles in the early years. He loves different kinds of music than Paul would tend to, along with the kinds of music Paul did. He said his favorite composer is John Cage, who was an avant-garde composer of, if you will, classical music, but compositions, very intellectual music. He did take a lot of LSD in pot. He helped at Monterey Music Festival the next year, 1967, on the board of directors as part of our evidence. They gave out 10,000 pieces of LSD to people that would have to be approved by the CIA and or MI5. Would he know? We're contending he probably did and liked the idea, thought it was a great social experiment or whatever. Okay. He also is probably Scottish. He lives in Scotland, and he's also said, if you want to go to the next slide, he said that grandchildren on your knee, it slips out in When I'm 64, which was written by Paul at about age 15. But Bill ends up with a little Scottish brogue there. Also, though the Campbell name comes from Fred Labour's questionable article, we're going to argue in the next slide that in fact, and if you can go to the next slide, that in fact he is a Campbell, and that might have been actually part of the Fred Labour thing that he heard. The reason is, here he is in a Campbell tartan in the 1970s. Next slide. And the only similar to Campbell tartan in the McCartney tartans is one designed by Linda McCartney herself for home use for this man we're claiming is a Campbell. By the way, Scottish people, if you go to the next slide, Scottish people actually arrange themselves in clans based by family, and Irish by county. Okay, mostly. Now, common sense. We're looking for naturalness in our explanations of the evidence and of the whole idea set. That's part of our evidentiary claims. And we do not need to say that it's common sense as a showstopper to start. We may learn something. Next slide. The cover-up does continue. There is continued doctoring, stretching, and changing of photos and events. I mentioned a few of them, that the known motorcycle accident from 1966 actually did not occur at the end of the year, but in the beginning in an anthology. They don't mention Epstein's breakdown. They do claim that that it was a motorcycle accident at the time when, in fact, there was the death, we claim. Next slide. The new clues continue. Well, why would they, right? Isn't that schizophrenic? Why would they continue now that most of the Beatles are dead? I mean, the originals. Well, you might want to still indicate some feelings. You might also feel a little bit obliged. Next slide. Now, we're going to go into the Love album and the Free as a Bird. Now, these slides will go by fairly quickly, but there are lots and lots of imagery, okay? The Love album was 2006. And the Free as a Bird video was 1995. Next slide. Oh, yes, we do need to notice things carefully and properly. So I'm going to go through these so that you know what the objections to them are and the actual facts. Next slide. Next slide. Okay. So there was a rumor on the internet from a particular music station that said that there was a code on the Love album Clue. Next slide. This is the source for that claim. Next slide. This is the Love album that came out in 2006, the actual album cover. Next slide. It derives from a photo taken in 1963 of the original four Beatles. Okay. They are rearranged, and I've given what they're rearranged as there. Next slide. There are several things about this that we will see. When we mirror the image, we get a word code, which would be confirmation that there are clues. We get an emphasis on boots remaining at the end. All right. Now, we know that boots and shoelessness have been emphasized in several clues, not just Abbey Road 1969 cover. Okay. We also have a mustache in the O, and we know that now that the mustache would have been a part of a cover-up for the face of Bill, and as a deflection from the other Beatles so that you don't notice Bill. Next slide. This is the mirroring of that album cover. So you might notice, first of all, it says code. And of course, John also said, here's another clue for your all lyric in Glass Onion. By the way, that was recorded on September 11th, 1968. For September 11th, 1967, the largely eulogistic magical mystery tour film started filming. So we have 2 years where September 11th is actually memorialized in what they were doing. But anyway, code. So there are clues. Next slide. On the left, we have the mirroring boots, emphasizing shoes or feet. And in the middle, turned around, we have a mustache-looking thing with a pyramid over it. If there was infiltration, we don't want to say Illuminati. That is too broad. But there would be a cultic emphasis, and we know that Bill himself really likes Aleister Crowley, which alternate religion kind of thing. A lot of hierarchical insiders and intelligence agents have that sort of interest. It is fairly rampant in alternative art circles as well. Next slide. The Love album clues themselves are referring partly to this mustache cutout shape. Now, I've given the whole insert. This is a paper insert that was on the Sgt. Pepper album in 1967. That was the first album the Beatles did after the death, according to our side. Okay, so we're going to talk as if our side is right. So they did this album as the first album after the death, and it has all these cutouts, an emphasis to military or intelligence agents, if you will. And here is a close-up of that cutout mustache. And it looks very like, if we go back one slide, can we go back? It looks a little bit like that mustache. Next slide. Yeah. So now we have a code, we have a clue, we have a sound. I'm not going to play it for you right now, but the reprise of the Sgt. Pepper song, the theme song on that album, where they sing Sgt. Pepper's Lonely 3 times backward, ends up saying very clearly a full phrase. It was a fake mustache. It was a fake mustache. It was a fake mustache. Now, next slide. And next. Not all mustaches were fake on the Beatles, but they began to draw fake mustaches on all of them. These are early February 1967 in that same Beatles book that made the text disclaimer that Paul had not died. They began to draw. You notice George Harrison has no mustache on the left and has a mustache in the mirror. Mirroring and doubling begins to be a major theme in the Beatles' works, not only in the clue about the death date, which is in a way hidden, but very clear in context, okay? Also, John Lennon has a mustache that is, if you see a close-up, drawn in little lines. You can really see that it is not real hair, okay? Next slide. The next month, there's a full picture of Paul. Now, this is Paul, okay? It's from, I think, 1965. It is Paul. And what he is he's in a very similar look to Bill, okay? So if he's a different fellow, we have a picture here where a number of things are chosen to be very similar. One is that his hair is parted closer to the middle. Bill began to part his hair closer to the middle right to start, or a straight comb down. And we will see that that is likely because his hair grows in a different whirling direction. But Paul's hair slightly on his left here, but it's sort of combed in the middle. He also has very strong lighting on his nose, which makes it look a little thinner, but it's not as thin as Bill's. He has a weird mustache drawn on and a very big change. They are emphasizing tampered photography, and it is the last time that they did this on the big cover. So they've gone from the others to a big cover of something's different with Paul. Next slide. These are those boots emphasized. We're going to move to the boots. Why are we going through the clues? I try not to go through the clues in general. I try not to go through all the photo tampering. The reason is, the fact is that if it exists, it's very extensive. You have to spend some time with it, and you have to be patient. That's why we spent the first hour going over what you need to remember. So the boots emphasis here, we'll go to the next slide. The first shoelessness did not appear in 1969. It appeared in 1967. It was in the I Am the Walrus movie clip from Magical Mystery Tour in 1967. A film still was printed in the booklet. And on page 13, the unlucky number are bloody shoes. They added blood to the shoes. We will see this. They added red to the shoes. He also is not wearing shoes. If you think that Paul as a figure, now remember it's Bill playing a Paul, but also being himself. We have a song which is about a walrus, which you will later find out is a metaphor for Paul. John wore the walrus suit in the movie, if you know about that, but it's a metaphor for Paul. The reason is there are wonky eyes, there's a mustache, and there's a death mouth. So I'm not trying to be too gross. I'm saying if we are dealing with a dead person, that is what happened. He had a smashed head, wonky eyes, and they used a mustache later for the cover-up. So Bill's left foot is not a shoe there. He's just slightly lifting his foot. You can see it in the movie, and you can see the flatness of his right foot there. The 13 is unlucky, and it says, love the three Beatles on the drum, and there is blood added to the shoes beside the drum, which were on Paul as Paul. So Bill is playing Paul. Next slide. Here we have a close-up of those bloody shoes. You can see the blood added. You can see the 13 and love the three Beatles. Next slide. Here is love the three Beatles. You can read it. This is like a finger pointing to the three on the left. And you can see the whole image there again down below. Next slide. Here's an example of the doctoring. This would be raised as an argument. The finger pointing and the three and the shoes are all ignored in the new images of that image. They only give a squiggle. That's a keychain, and also on the mugs. They only show a squiggle. They do not show a three. It's a kind of a simple obfuscation, and yet we will see in a moment all kinds of other new clues. So on the one hand, something that's old and really poignant is dropped, and something else is added, and there's a kind of a confusion. Next slide. The suggestion of three is not something that you would tend to think of if it's all just a joke. Yes, there would be three left, but it would be a very poignant goodbye that they would be saying. They can be as obvious as they want, and if they don't come out with DNA, you can say that they didn't do it. All right? The Very Together compilation album came out with 4 candles, 1 snuffed out, and yet it says Very Together. That's an example of threeness. Also, John wrote 1 and 1 and 1 is 3, come together over me. That song particularly has a lot of references to death and corpse stuff, and also to the flat top or taking off of his head, to a sideboard of a car, and so on. And so this is come together over my grave. That's how we are interpreting it. Okay, that's our evidence. Next slide. How much time do we have left?
Oh, about, let's see, 26 minutes, I think.
Great. I think we will be able to get through this. Yeah. Because a lot of this is imagery and you can pause it. Okay. But now what about the shoes? Why blood on shoes? Why emphasis on feet? By the way, he also sang in the Come Together Over Me. All right. He also sang about, what's it called? You have feet down below your knees. Now, of course, we all have feet below our knees. But why the emphasis on feet? A lot of people only know the strange emphasis on Abbey Road cover. That was bizarre looking. Now we've taken it back to 1967. We've shown this 13, the Love the Three Beatles, the Together and 1 and 1 and 1 is 3, and so on. You have to know that there are only certain themes that come up, and they come up constantly. So why the Beatles? Why the boots? Well, the Beatles did wear Beatle boots. They were known for it. You get a picture of them wearing them. There's a close-up, and there's a drawing John did where the figure is wearing such boots, but they're disheveled. Okay? All right? We also may note that the legs seem dissociated from whatever is in the boot, such as the shoes and the feet, that there may be a dislocation of feet that has been put together again, like a Humpty Dumpty. We also may note, if we go to the next slide, that the walrus is Paul is deliberately called another clue. As I said, walrus, why would you have it? A dead body and a mustache imagery. Well, if Paul there, he's wearing the Beatle boots, John draws the Beatle boots. There's shoelessness in 1967. I've shown 2 images of it, and there's 1969. Okay, on the Abbey Road cover. And I pointed out that the walrus goes to Paul as an image. does not mean that he wore the walrus suit, that Bill as Paul wore the walrus suit in 1967. It's in I Am the Walrus song. Walrus gumboot. A gumboot is a black boot, or a emphasis on boots. Juju eyeballs, strange eyeballs, wonky eyeballs, walrus eyeballs, a flat top, a monkey finger of a corpse, or the monkey's paw myth. All of this is referred to in some songs, and the drawings has it too, plus more. Next slide. So why boots, shoelessness, blood on footwear? Was there broken ankles? Was there dislocated feet? Were the shoes kicked? Now, if there was no death, there was none of this. But why would we find this so consistently bloody, but fairly rare and emphasized? Okay. Well, is there a car impact? Next slide. The famous Abbey Road cover does show show Paul. Now, remember, this is Bill. Okay. But he's playing Paul for us instead of being himself. That doesn't mean that he does that all the time. He's not a permanent double. He's a person with his own family. But here he is being Paul, and it's on the side where people would be hit. This is in England, you drive on the other side of the road than North America. Okay. There's also an emphasis on a white car, and it's a beetle image as though there's something to do with a beetle. There's a license plate that says 281F, which looks like 28IF. Now, Paul himself would have been 27. So that's a silly clue, except that George Harrison there and some of the Beatles were very interested in alternative religion and India. And in India, you date your astrological birth date from when you were conceived, not born. Okay, so we're just talking about, was there a car impact or was it made to look that way when the Beatles saw it? That does not mean that it was a car impact. You could drop somebody from a building. You could have a gunshot wound, a sledgehammer, and frame the image. Or you could also have a car impact that was arranged to happen. Most people think it was a car crash of two cars, but we do not see that. We, in fact, see in the imagery an impact in front of a car most often. Next slide. Here is John playing dead in front of his own Rolls Royce in 1967. Next slide. Here's George Harrison playing About to Be Hit in the eulogistic Magical Mystery Tour. Not that it's only eulogistic, partly eulogistic Magical Mystery Tour film. Blue Jay Way is his song. Blue Jay Way is an area in Laurel Canyon, which has led some people to think that Paul was murdered there. However, the date and the being back in England are confirmable in other ways, and therefore, probably it's just an emphasis on the creepy, cultic, mafiosi elements of Laurel Canyon that have now been exposed through the efforts of Dave McGowan and others over time. Okay, so here is George Harrison playing on the street and about to be hit. Next slide. He fades in from this image, which is an actor playing dead on a slab with no head, bloody neck, and called Magical Mystical Boy, as though there is an alternative religion excuse for this death. Maybe they already suspected it was murder, or Bill's new interest in Aleister Crowley might have influenced this, that Paul is turned into a saint. He's in a kind of a heaven. He can come and visit you. That would be the kind of thing that we would marshal more evidence towards if I had time, and also that you would get other testaments in a court. Okay, next slide. John in 71 or 72, got into the idea of taking stethoscopes to everything to say how it really felt and what the spirit and emotion was. But here he's taking a stethoscope to a street in front of a car. Ignore for the moment that it's a beetle and white. It's just a car. And if a person was found dead in front of a car, his mother is a possibility for that. She was hit by a police car. But now we notice that it's a beetle car, so this may well be a Paul reference, and it's white, which doesn't mean Paul has to have been wearing white, but it might have been actually a white car, even if it wasn't a beetle that was staged or hit him. Next slide. Now, Love in 2006 with that cover with the emphasis on the boots and the mustache. We're not going through this to list a bunch of clues. We're showing that there's a consistency about boots, blood, cars, white cars, Beatle references, and in a moment, young man references, Paul references, and so on. In Love, the show itself, there is a car impact. It's with a white Beatle. Now, the remaining 3 out of 5 Beatles and George Martin had to do with making this show. All right. George Harrison was around for the plans of the show. Actually, I think I got the date of the album confused with the date of the show. But anyway, the show was around when George, I think he was contributing. But anyway, they were involved in planning this. So they would want to still eulogize Paul. You can think of the clues as eulogy rather than clues for you alone. They're eulogistic. So in one sense, they will continue naturally, even without being a hoax. They will continue, but some will be covered up. So on the one hand, you can say that Cirque du Soleil doesn't have to know, but somebody would want this to be in the show. All right. So this is a Beatle from our position. The Beatle white car hits a woman, and it's very dramatic, and she's carried up and off. And I think she's actually hit in the show. But next slide. Next. Yeah. Here she is being pulled up, and the people behind her are carrying pieces of that car to make it look like an impact. Very clever. Next slide. But there is another time a car hits or almost hits. I don't know if it's almost hit or hit a person in this show. It's less showy, and it's a young man. And it's shown in this broadcast, which might be a promotional film for the show. It's shown directly and sinisterly. This then, and in the whole context, you can say, is the real death. All right. This is more of a serious reference, even if the woman is more showy. This is the kind of logic you would use when dealing with art references. Next slide. And here he is. He's on the right. He's kind of flying off there. Okay, fly. Whoo. Next slide. There is a car impact shown in Free as a Bird video, 1995. The Free as a Bird video is a fairly autobiographical video, and it is stated to 1966 or 7, and it is a death in front of a car. Next slide. We know it is because there's John Lennon in the crowd there. They've added him in to be looking in front of the car. Now, he is wearing his late 1966, early 1967 wear. It is slightly after the period when Paul actually died, but they may have found an image that they could use of him reaching and looking. So there may be a convenience in what they chose. Next slide. This is Harrison's last album, the All Things Must Pass, and you can see a crushed Beatle. It's a car, but it is a crushed person as a Beatle, if it's a metaphor. Okay, so there's a crushed Beatle even there. Next slide. George Harrison's song Savoy Truffle has gotten a lot of bad rep over the year, but why was it included? Well, it is talking about pain, massive pain and stuffing back pain. And what is the item here? These kinds of things are evidence. They're the evidence of how people felt, what they thought, and seeing how detailed this stuff gets, that the only anchor in the song for what the pain would be is a reference to Paul and a reference to not knowing where he is. Okay, we all know oobla dee blah da, but can you tell me where you are? Coconut fudge blows down those blues, but you'll have to have them all pulled out after the Savoy Truffle. You might not feel it now, but when the pain cuts through, you're going to know, and how the sweat is going to fill your head. When it becomes too much, you'll shout aloud. What is the shouting about? Where are you? Next slide. Paul did not have to actually have a decapitation to have the metaphor of losing his head or part of his head, being a flat top, having a smashed head, being a Humpty Dumpty who smashed apart in his ankles, his wrists maybe, his head. Of course, you can use a metaphor, simplification in some things. Some young students stole the head off the Capitol record board on Sunset Boulevard itself in 1969. All right. And it was left by Capitol Records. The usual excuse is they wanted to make money off the rumor. Next slide. But we see it continued in Sir Paul McCartney, Bill Campbell's own crest. His crest contains a helmet. The helmet is missing the top of the head. The top of the head is missing there. The bird is, I don't know why it's not showing here, but the bird, if you go to the original crest, the bird itself is standing on, of course, this missing head. You can also notice that the eye visor, what should be an eye visor itself, is low. It's like a screaming mouth. Okay. Also, the only red areas on this helm in the whole crest are on the head, and they do tend to mean martyrdom in heraldry. And the rest of the crest is black and gold, and that's it. Black means mourning, melancholy, and death. Next slide. Bill Campbell's coat of arms, and somehow it's missing here. You actually see the coat itself has two circles. It's usually explained as two CDs or records, but it's clearly visually a guitar doubled horizontally. Again, mirroring and doubling. Two guitars, two Pauls, two realities. Next slide. Occam's razor doesn't mean that you just have to have everything simple. As Jim has pointed out many times, it means that if you're adding an explanation, it better have a very good reason, and it all has to be fully accounting for all of the details of the argument. It shouldn't just be something added to make an explanation like God did it when you weren't talking about God. Next slide. So either it's a joke hoax or nothing at all, or it's an inaccurate idea that it's a joke, and in fact, all of this stuff plus more and all the historical reasoning argues for it. How much time do we have?
About 12 minutes, Claire.
Okay, next slide. We have to reinterpret those historical references. We have to understand that biographies may put down the idea, but they may contain, if you will, material, we can call it clues, to differences. We actually would be showing the timeline and the rumor going back that far as a naturalness. It would be part of things in court. Next slide. What happened to the rumor? People asked a lot of questions. The media actually interviewed a lot of people. These things are more available now. Roby Young, who was a New York DJ, presented the idea and it took off. Next slide. The rumor has to have crossed the ocean. It remained mostly undocumented in England, except for that text reference and Tony Barrow now and Emilio Lari. And the possibility of the news broadcast in the U.S. on September 12th, and also the possibility of newspaper articles referred to in that Day in the Life paperback edition. But the rumor contained early ideas: car impact and death of Paul. Next slide. What happened to it? It flowed among a few people, we argue. This is the kind of filling in of the storyline. It flowed among a few people. The direct insider circle would mostly know, and other people would not, but they might hear hush hush, or just that there was something odd and be told to look on the clues. Next slide. If there are no authorities to listen, then threats and bribes and killings can take out a few dissenters. Next slide. Media interest peaked in the USA. There was that voice analysis. There was a mock trial with F. Lee Bailey. The Beatles Apple Corporation heads met for 3 days without comment, and interviews were done with all kinds of people. Next slide. The public was disparaged. We were told that we needed a myth, that we were not reminded that the clues were shocking in implication and detail. Next slide. The internet has allowed more forensic comparison and so on. So you need to separate your knowledge as I went over here. Next slide. You could know you need best case scenarios, but it is not cherry picking. You have to look at the whole argument. Next slide. We do have some public experts that have spoken. They are forensics experts. We also have, of course, the voice expert and a number of people on psychology talking about this. But public knowledge is also expertise. You can educate yourself with what the experts are talking about or make good points. Next slide. The claims for the replacement can be generally right, but make slight errors. So we have to forgive some Paul is dead people for getting some things wrong. For instance, problems with ears can be more generally noted than just by experts. Special lighting on teeth might exaggerate a problem. So now Jim has shown some of this material in another broadcast, and the comments that were made were not specific. So I'm giving you a rationale to continue the work of that broadcast. I'm actually giving you a conceptual framework. The heights cannot be just looking taller. You need to understand each image. Eye color is known to be different in different key images. You have to say some of it would be lighting and some of it would be age, but would a dark brown person's real eyes change into bluish green later as a light older person? No, unless they're 90. But if they have a green with flecks, which we also see Bill having in the Strawberry Fields video, then indeed, yes, you would have a lightening of the eyes like that. He also has dark lighting in part of the video, so just ignore that part and look for when they do a close-up. Next slide. We have teeth, eye color, hair direction, curl tendency. You can comb a curve the opposite way by flipping it, combing it, but you also have a natural whorl. And it seems as though even wet, Paul's hair curved to the right in general on his forehead, and Sir Paul's curves to the left. Now he has it very short, and it's forced to the right. We have the feet as toe issues, foot length. We have the height. We have body language issues. Next slide. Body shape, body hair, and face shapes. Next slide. Photos don't have to look different to you for you to assess the report by the forensic scientists. They are talking about a number of things. The mere age and angle are moot until you understand the arguments. Next slide. So when you're prejudiced, where would you look? Well, you often would tend to note only very specific things. You have to separate the two time periods. Next slide. You have to know that some things can and cannot be changed by plastic surgery. And just because somebody has a slight angle change, the issue may be how a plane would tend to look, right? Would it tend to suddenly go out? You have to imagine in 3 dimensions if you're going to do it personally, but the forensic scientists did it frontally. Next slide. Age, lighting, and studio magic, as I said in the very beginning, cannot be your only categories. You have to look at those outliers that we saw in the beginning. You have to understand that age is an outlying thing, but would that head change to that head? And don't immediately say yes. You need to say that does look rather strange, and then go to the similar photos and see if the strange stuff that showed up here really still is only in the second person. Next slide. Here I have done a comparison for you. The outlier effects would have a slight difference. So would straight on shots would have a slight difference. What the forensic scientists did, if we look at the 2 bottom circles, is they said, we're going to take a frontal image and we're going to say it's rough within 6% change allowance. We're going to allow for the jaw and the lighting and so on, but we're going to measure proportions every way, bone-wise. Forensic scientist offhand has said, oh, you need a skull to measure proportions. That's, of course, ridiculous. What you actually need is a good set that of roughly close angle. And here I've shown that. And then you have the outliers up to the side. And we have at the top center the doctored photo of the Sergeant Pepper gatefold where it actually doesn't quite match each. Next slide. Okay, they're discussing frontal photos. Next. They're talking about dental analysis, but they may overstate the case about Paul's left side. And again, you have to remember that the chipped tooth was on the front, and it was repaired in 1966. And he did not die in late. He did not have a motorcycle crash in late 66. Next. Jaw shape and position, and how many angles. They call that curves. So sorry, I'm going to try to do it. Curves, or curves. They analyzed that. They left leeway. Next slide. Next. Thanks, Chance. Thanks. So if you have to begin to understand things, you would need to take time with this slide. If you match any item, whether it's the tops matching and a width, or the tops matching and the bottom, or the distance to a feature from the top, things don't match in these two people consistently. So you need to match some width or height, some position of the total, up or down, side to side, and something within that height, like where the eyes are to where the nose are. And some things cannot be surgically changed. Next slide. This is what happens when you actually take, now this is extreme, a very wide, short face and a very long face. And try to find a combination. Certain things will move down and in, certain things will move up and in, but the general bottoms and tops will become squished and changed. And we do find some doctoring. Next slide. The jawlines are not merely ad hoc reasoning, one item. They actually are talking about many items at once. They did a summary of their findings. And again, it is not whether you see it, it is a method to know it. And it would be in court with questions, but can we see their argument? And I've tried to show you how you can understand them and take them seriously. All right. Now, merely finding a different line of a jaw as I move, the line changes, but it's whether in a fairly consistent way, fairly good angle, and fairly same expression, whether that would be so. And then we move to other issues. What people keep forgetting is there's always new issues you need to think of. So if the jaws don't tend to match, well, what about the eyes? And what I'm trying to say is in every area, next slide, in every area, you actually find the same tendency of change. Where if an expert came in, they would say, you know, that is, if you take all of the proper considerations and objections in mind, like the hair might be flipped or the teeth might have a slight difference. We have fake ears, we have behavior, we have feet, height, we have, and so on, eyes and so on. If all of it has this strong tendency like the jawline, when considered, it is what people should call, as colloquially, absolute proof. But it is not DNA. And of course, nothing is absolute proof, even when it's close to best proof like DNA. So what are you going to say? All of this is wrong. And I'm not talking about stupid statements. I mean, really understanding photos. Next slide. We're nearly done here, but here is one of the best. Oops, I have a chart that got in there somehow mistakenly. I don't know if Chance can actually click that and take that out. Probably not.
Don't worry about it.
But anyway, what we have here is we do have a photographic problem, if we're honest. On the left is Paul. There is a slight angle change from the, from the angle of the camera on these people. Paul is further behind, and it does change your height to be further behind. That is partly a camera effect, and it's partly a natural proportion effect. And you do not need to be a formal expert to go and learn those things. However, they are roughly in line with their feet. They are roughly in line with how much they are bending. Mal is bending by a dip that comes from being wide-legged, and Paul is bending like that. But they both are actually bending. How much higher would he have to be the man on the right? The man on the right, who is Bill, in our case, this is 1967. Okay, Bill is photographed with Mal Evans during the Magical Mystery Tour film here. And now the camera is even on them. So yes, that will add some height to the man compared to being further behind. And he might have heels on, but what are his body proportions there compared to how those body proportions and how much of a change would be required on the left? It is not absolute, but we will find a strong tendency of these issues in the photos thereafter. And when they are not, there is always a photographic reason. For instance, Bill is much further behind or something, or further in front. Next slide. The ears not only have a change where there is a further, the upper leg of the antihelix. The antihelix is that splayed thing. The upper leg of it has moved back in Bill. Okay, it is wider in Bill. You cannot change that without deformity for the cartilage in plastic surgery. What you can do is wear false ears for a while. You can get plastic surgery to change an overall stretch on the ear. You can get some additions put in, but you can't change a huge, very slight angle like that. And how far back it is compared to how far forward. That's the upper arrow there, the blue arrows. It's also narrower versus wider. So Paul himself has a narrower one and Bill has a wider one. Is that simply due to lighting? No, because the lighting is highlighting where the arc is. Also, you have an overall angle change on the bottom back of the ear. Paul's is a kind of a rounded angle, okay? Bill's is a longer, more oblique angle, but it ends up meaning there's less of a little roundness at the turn of the angle. That's the red line at the bottom. Now, if that's perspective, you would have to have a massive change in the head angle, but you don't. The next, that's like a jawline. There it is, suggestive, highly suggestive from very specific comparisons chosen very specifically that I can't go into. And it tends the way the jaw evidence and the height evidence, but only if you've been careful about each part of the evidence. Next slide. This is John Lennon's drawing. John Lennon's drawing has been disparaged as a doodle. It is also disparaged as surreal. Those kinds of things discount what is actually found in the drawing. The head is smashed on the left. I think I'm showing up backwards, so I have to do it. There you go. It's his left. For some reason, my image is coming back. It's his left. It's our right. Okay. There is a huge blob coming out of the top of the head, like that. The top is zigzagged. I'm trying to find my camera here. Okay, zigzag like that. Whoop, 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 up and down. There's also a big a big jag or zigzag of bone on the left. On our left. Parietal bones smash. They're the back part of the head, and they're two big pieces. If they smashed up, they would tend to smash this way. John didn't draw photorealistically usually, so he might do a diagrammatic thing to show that there's a break. The break would be the top blowout. And you know this, Jim, the whole top would blow out. And you could be lying on your side, but it's still blown out. Okay? The frontal bone is your forehead. The frontal bone would do this. It actually tends to smash. So if you're hit here and you're lying this way, your parietal goes split like that. Top of your head collapses. The front collapses back. The front bone is basically broken and it moves. And all of this you do not have to be a medical doctor to understand, but you do need to look at what bones are, look at crash victims, and also think about what would be moving. The sutures would tend to break. So, summary of that. The left side of his head has a brokenness. Indeed, the frontal bone would move that way. The frontal bone goes halfway across your eyes. The eyes are pulled. The right eye is more closed. The left eye is more staring. The mouth is not drawn ugly in this picture, but there are other images that we do not have time to go into that I didn't include, where in fact, you do get a kind of, like that, a walrus effect. Okay. Also, Sir Paul actually mimics it several times. You could say he's joking, but I think, and of course the case would argue, that he's benefited from the death. And therefore, it's okay for him sometimes to be happy about the condition of the body. At other times, he's a far nicer person, and we're not putting down all his music here. We also must note that that John talked about a flat top. He talked about an Eggman. The flat top is from Come Together. The Eggman is I Am the Walrus, with the shoelessness in the imagery and the Love the Three Beatles. I am a walrus in the song says Goo Goo Gadoob. And Goo Goo Gadoob is what Humpty Dumpty says just because he's broken and smashed in Finnegan's Wake by James Joyce. So John is very clever and he's a little surreal and he was taking some drugs, and usually that is the whole explanation for all of this. But the forensic directions and diagrammatic qualities of the clues and the artwork would suggest differently. This particular item, as you know, Jim, was snuck out to a collector. It's on the back of a fairly grisly avant-garde album that they did. But the album was cut at the top of the bottom. The front was folded back. back like that. It touched the image, so it was actually protected. It was a protected image, and he gave it very specially. We also notice a shovel to come together over me, and a little dog for comfort, the broken ankles, the beetle boot style, and it fits everything, but it is awkward. It's a little awkward, as though he was grieving. Next slide is the last slide. And there is the coat of arms. So we may note that we do have historical, artistic, psychological, historical black ops kind of considerations, information from forensics, information from biographies that we get into, the rumor going back, all the naturalness to things. And we have continued and very serious types of clues that are fairly related easily of a white car tread, and 5 lines for Beatles in music, 3 Beatles, and so on, a coat of arms. And Sir Paul's own coat of arms, I wish I did have the slide there, shows 2 guitars and the mirroring, and it has blood and a missing top of the head and a screaming mouth.
Thank you, Claire. For those who want
you.
to take a look at the forensic evidence in anticipation of Claire's full presentation, they might want to review the article, Why Ringo's Confession We've Replaced Paul Appears to Be Authentic, which I published in Veterans Today. I want to thank you, Claire, for coming on the show and giving us the benefit of your research. This is Jim Fetzer, your host on The Real Deal, thanking Claire Kuhn for being here and all of you for listening.